Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. What we're going to do is that we're going to start off in just around 1 minute past the hour. It gives us enough time to regroup, charge our glasses and our coffee cups before we get going. If you want to pose a question to Kate, Adrian, and Will, you can get in there first by posing a question either two ways. One way is actually posting a comment in the chat, which is denoted by the speech bubble, the single speech bubble at the bottom of your toolbar, or you can actually pose a question anonymously through the Q&A, which is denoted by the, guess what, two speech bubbles also in your control panel there. A recording of this webinar will be made and distributed to you along with a PDF version of the slide deck. As well there. Lots to get through, appreciate that. Not enough time, but you'll be welcome that this is more organised than a parliamentary debate in the House of Commons. So, you know what, we're off to a good start already. Fantastic. Right, okay, welcome to this Consumer Duty Data Everywhere. But where are the answers? Delighted to be joined by colleagues Kate and Will from Avyse consultancy firm. They're supporting organisations help embed and also ensure that they are continuously compliant with the expectations of the duty there. And this is us for the next hour or so. You get the opportunity to post your questions, as I said before, in the chat as well as the Q&A. And you can tick the anonymous box if you want to pose a question there. If we can't answer your question for whatever reason due to time constraints there, we will do so. We'll take those offline if that's okay with yourself. And again, for those people who've just joined us, you can have the opportunity to actually recall and review the slides at the end of the day, which will send to you in PDF format. You also get an opportunity to subscribe to all of our amazing blogs from both Elephants Don't Forget and also Avyse there. And these are the discussion topics that we're going to cover off. And when I get my words correctly, we might actually work through this webinar on time as well. So too little or too much data, we're going to address that. We're going to look at where the FCA is probing, challenging firms, asking questions of your firm and asking questions of the whole sector. Also looking at actually what should be in a board pack and also where we can actually challenge ourselves to actually make sure that by the end of July, we've got that all in order. We also want to square away the opportunity of actually turning inwardly focused MI into outwardly focused MI, and also must have data points around vulnerability there. Lots to cover off, but if you've got anything else that you want to cover off, post it in the chat. It'd be great to see what you are talking about and what's keeping you up at night. So to that end, we actually have a number of poll questions that we want to pose to you, and also to challenge our panelists to answer for themselves there. So on your screens now, you'll see our first poll question. How confident are you that your approach to data and MI would stand up to regulatory scrutiny? So, yeah, 1 being not confident at all, 5 being, you know what, we're there already. I don't know why you asked the question for them. So, yeah, 1, not confident at all, completely confident there. So, Kate, before we go over to the poll results there, what are you seeing in the industry? What are you seeing is keeping your clients up at night?
Well, I think, data is a big subject at the moment right now. Particularly in relation to, I think Consumer Duty board reports are on everyone's mind. And as a result, there's a huge amount of data that has to be put into those to demonstrate compliance with Consumer Duty. We do quite a huge amount of work with clients on both sides. So we deal with clients who are looking to get it right without the regulator asking them to. But we also do quite a lot of 166 work. And that 166 work that we're doing at the moment, I don't think I've seen a requirement notice or a question come through from the regulator in the last 6 months that hasn't got a Consumer Duty element attached to it. So it is very much flavour of the month with the regulator. It's a tool that they are really pushing in terms of getting firms to change their direction of travel.
And Will, when you see the results, hopefully that are displayed on your screen as well as everybody else's screen there, 40% are somewhat confident that their approach to data and MI would stand up to FCA scrutiny. Does that surprise you, or?
Yeah, I think that is surprising, and it's good to hear that so many people are confident. I think what we're seeing, and maybe in the nature of our work as consultants, we've seen that people fall into the trap of program leads or risk teams leading the implementation plan and then it falling away afterwards. And I think we've seen a trend of firms not really understanding what the good customer outcomes are and what the good touch points are across their whole product life cycle and their journey. And then because they've not got that understanding, they've not been able to pin proper MI at all those different touch points. So that's what we're seeing.
Yet still 34%, Adrian, are slightly confident or not confident at all out of, 500.
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier, weren't we? I think there is a sense of, my phrase, learned helplessness going on here, where I see a lot of firms bemoaning the fact that this looks like a difficult thing to achieve, and we could really do with a regulation just telling us how to do it, rather than sort of letting us work it out for ourselves, and inevitably fail type feedback is what I'm getting from the marketplace.
And with the intention of actually wanting to actually drill down on some of the key pinch points that you probably have experienced implementing or embedding the duty within your firm, we've asked this question of you, which is, how confident are you that your data is, we've got a number of answers on the right hand side of the screen, which is 1 to 6. How confident are you in certain aspects of gaining MI, drawing MI, and obviously developing MI? So 1 being not confident at all in these specific areas, and 5 being completely confident that you are in these areas. Kate, the regulator has tightened the screw up, a number of announcements over the last few weeks, not even months there. Is it still a real challenge for firms to get this right, whether it's quantity and whether it's quality of data?
I think, yeah, it is a real challenge, and it's hard. I think all firms should be cognizant that we are being asked to do something that hasn't been done before. So in respect of maturity cycles, everyone is learning right now, not only firms, but the regulator as well. And I think the most important point firms can take is start at the beginning and start simple, and don't try to overcomplicate it, would be my key message from today. Yeah, I don't think even FCA knows all the answers yet. So as a firm, don't feel like you have to know all the answers. What you just need to do is try your best to make sure that you are evidencing those outcomes as you move forward. And we'll talk a little bit more what good looks like in the rest of this session, I think.
Okay. So when we look at the results, Will, and don't know if you can squint or clean your glasses as I try to interpret this alongside others there. When we look at the results here, in terms of like where people are confident or somewhat confident or not confident at all there, anything jumps out at you at the polls that we've just captured?
So what's the amber? That's not confident, isn't it?
Somewhat confident, yes.
Somewhat confident. I mean, there's a lot of somewhat confidence, and I think what I'm seeing in the stuff that's happened with establishing comprehensive suites of MI is that stuff's still sitting in operational silos, and firms not joining the dots between the different areas in their business, or they might have regurgitated or repackaged certain data points that they might have been using to measure, I don't know, a TCF principle, for example, like QA results or customer surveys, and relying too much on that rather than thinking a bit wider across the customer journey.
And I think just one observation from my point of view is, if I was looking at that as the regulator, I'd see that the level of confidence in delivering against each of those outcomes is lower than what is effectively being delivered to the board. And just logically, I think you need to challenge that amongst yourselves in terms of the board will only have confidence that they're getting the right data if all those other outcomes are being met across the rest of the business. So there should be a closer alignment between those two.
Yeah, and of course, to what extent are the boards actually intimately involved in this process, and to what extent have they subbed it to the second one?
Yes. And we're going to be talking about that. So when we look at what we're seeing in the marketplace, Kate, are we seeing a patchwork of data and MI? So some bits great over here, but some bits less so here. And where do you see that? Is there a pattern that can be deduced by firms that you're working with?
I think there is a real mix out there in the marketplace. And I think it depends whether you're kind of a smaller firm to a larger firm. So with the larger firms, where we see the current risks is around the time it is taking those firms to kind of move their MI framework in the right direction. With the larger the firm, it's like moving, sorry, the Titanic. It takes longer, it takes more IT intervention, and there's a longer bureaucracy to go through all the different steps. Smaller firms have the advantage of being slightly more agile in pulling together data and getting it to the right person at the right time, but they might have a little bit more risk around whether they're actually collecting that data in the first place and who it is going to. So there's a real mix in terms of manual collection right through to automated collection as well. I think that's one of the challenges firms are really facing.
Adrian, data speaks volume about your culture, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I saw a couple of related chats and questions in whatever the chat or thing is called about, what about this? Have we got to phone up all our customers and things like this? And, so I'll just go back to Kate's point that this is a journey. And I think the idea that you have to be able to substantiate everything now is ridiculous. There's a reasonableness test that you should all be viewing your requirements with. This is a journey. Where are you now? Have you taken reasonable steps? Do I have to phone up every single customer, even if they won't reply to my surveys? I think that's unreasonable. It's an unreasonable requirement. I think you need to show that your culture, is genuine and that you care about those outcomes of the customer and you've taken reasonable steps. So, and this is my point about the learned helplessness. There is a feeling that this is just impossible. I can't do it. I don't think that the regulator is setting out perfection as the outcome in 2024, if ever.
Yeah. Okay. Big question that everybody asks, probably about, regardless of whether we're talking about MI for consumer duty or other regulatory imperatives there, too much or too little data. On the one hand, senior managers are always saying they're inundated with data. On the other hand, do they have a number of data points or the critical data points that they need to make decisions on that? Will, what's your take on that first?
I think for the larger firms, there's going to be a lot of data out there, and it's just being really careful and making sure you select the right data and pitch at the right level. So for a larger firm, you might have an entity that offers several different credit product lines, like a mortgage or a credit loan, and it's about identifying what the synergies are in your data across those products. You might have customers with mortgages and you might have customers with loans, and you might be able to pick stuff out that you've already got around customers who have got affordability issues on a consumer loan, and are we able to pick out that data and have a conversation with them and use that data around their affordability on their mortgage, or something we can do there. Or there might be data around price and value across those products as well, where they're getting benefits on like an insurance benefit across both products, and pulling the data out to see if they're getting the benefits from both of those products, or are they double paying and you need to revisit those benefits. So I think the information's all there. I think you just need to be really careful about what you're pulling out and making sure you can match it up.
And what type of data and MI, Kate, do perhaps business lines need to be producing versus perhaps on an entity or group level?
Yeah, I think firms are struggling with this, and what I would say is go back to first principles in terms of what was the intended consequence of consumer duty, and what are the 4 outcomes? And I think you should always start with those 4 outcomes in terms of understanding your customer target market, as an example. What data have you got to show who your customers are, and how are you then using that data to show changes in trends and maybe areas where you're acting outside of your planned target market? So take each of those 4 outcomes and start really simple would be my advice, in terms of, okay, we've decided our customers look like this. What data point have we got within the business that can demonstrate that? And how regularly can that data point be captured and reviewed? And who should be reviewing it? So I would start really simple, go back to first principles of purpose, and just be cognizant that this is going to mature with time. So if you start now with the basics, you can work on the bells and whistles as you move forward, and you might add and change things with time. But if you need to have something that talks to each one of those 4 outcomes in the first instance now, if you haven't already.
Adrian,
advice.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Adrian, there's this tendency or a sense that, firms will default to repackaging data. There are dangers in that, aren't there?
Yeah, for sure. We speak to a lot of firms who perhaps are over-reliant on measures of consumer detriment as their litmus test for, are we doing a good job? And perhaps a little bit blinded. We come on to this fact, what does a good board pack look like? And are perhaps lost sight of the fact that we should be counting quantum of consumers, rather than percentage of consumers. So, for example, we're counting customer complaints. We're all over those, and we get hardly any. Is that in of itself a single measure of success? No, it should be. It should be taken into the round. And are you selling a product to a consumer group that has a propensity never to respond? If so, your measure is a nonsense measure. Yeah. So be careful. When we come onto this about, are you measuring the right things? So sometimes we can be gulled, not deliberately, but we can be gulled into a false sense of security because perhaps we're putting too much reliance on one data point. It should be a consolidation, which was Will's point earlier about firms struggling to weave together these disparate data streams.
Talking about issues and challenges, Will, pick up on some of the key issues and challenges that you've seen in firms that you're dealing with.
I think I'll talk about third-party blind spots. I think especially in consumer credit products or insurance products, you might have a distribution chain involved with a broker and a manufacturer, and you might have further companies involved a bit later on in the product life cycle. So I don't know if you've got an arrears process that might be outsourced to a debt collection agency. There's all kinds of MI that these entities are all collecting on your customer, which you should be thinking about what is going to be useful to monitor whether that customer is having a good outcome or a good experience, and talking to each other and sharing that data. So just again, stripping it really back, simply vulnerable customer data, complaints data, quality assurance data. There's all kinds of things that those 3 I've just described companies can share to monitor an outcome. I think it's all very easy to think, we're all FCA regulated in our own right. We'll just leave each other to deal with our own definition of vulnerability and leave that customer to interact with them on that part of the journey. But you need to link it all together. Yeah.
In our bid to make sure that we have every single colour on the colour spectrum here, we populated this slide there. Kate, what 2 or 3 points did you want to pick up on?
I think where firms find a challenge is often, if you let's try to look at understanding your whether you're operating within your target market. We stick with that example. There are so many different metrics firms can use to evidence that, and some firms are really drowning in data, and it's about understanding, well, which actually is my most important one and which one will give me the answer I need. So don't feel like you have to have everything in there to begin with. Start with your key primary points, and let's just test and challenge constantly. Is that giving me the right answer? And that kind of leads into the appropriate governance, which to me, this is the foundation of your data management and whether you will be using the data appropriately. Because fundamentally, you could have the most brilliant data management system and MI framework, but if it isn't being sent to the right people at the right time, if it isn't aligned to your risk appetite, and if it isn't really clear, then it's not going to be worth anything to your organization as you move forward. It has to mean something. So the number of board packs I see that have got consumer duty data in it, and it's pages, we're talking like 15 pages. If I'm a board member, I am lost. I want to know the top 3 data points. That's enough to say which area of which outcome is at risk right now. Is it that we've got an increasing number of vulnerable customers? Is it that the cost of living crisis has resulted in a shift in our target market, so we need to do something differently? Is it that our call telephony systems went down, and as a result, customers haven't been getting the right support for the last couple of weeks? You really need to focus in on key risks, and there should be no more than 3 or 4 at board level, moving down on a more granular basis.
Adrian, and based upon what Kate's saying, relying on lagging indicators is not going to cut the mustard, is it?
No, you need a balance. You need a balance. Kate's absolutely right. Yeah. So running a big firm, you're expecting your management to solve the problems that have come up last week. Yeah. So they're your lagging indicators. The phone system went down. Well, what have you done about it? Right. So, but where are your lead indicators? Where are you need this balance, and the lead indicators are much harder to mine. So where are your indicators showing you where your future problems are coming from? That's what the board want. And I'm with Kate. Any more than 5, it ain't getting actioned. Right. So it needs to be succinct. They got a lot on their plate, and it needs to be really clear. And it needs to be the top ones, not the ones that perhaps look good.
And in terms of like, what does good look like? I think that if everybody was asleep last week or watching the Commons with amusement about what was going on there, then they might have missed, obviously, the publication of what does good look like and good outcomes. I'll post that in the chat right for you now, so you can actually see all that there. But Will, what stood out for you in last week's publication?
There was a statistic around the wealth management and investment firms when the FCA had done a survey of to test effectively whether these companies understood what their vulnerable customer base looked like. And I think it was 69% of the firms that had completed the survey identified the fact that they hadn't had a single vulnerable customer. And I think that's quite surprising. And so I think it's going back to the basics that we've spoken about, is really identifying what your vulnerable customers' characteristics will look like. And I think we'll talk about vulnerable customers a little bit more later on, but firms really need to just have a think about their data, their customer base, and what the inherent vulnerable customer characteristics are, and start building the means to flag those.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of really helpful publications from the FCA last week in terms of the good practice guide examples that came out. I think the danger with the regulator is that often ends up on the desk of a second line individual, and really it's the first line and the board that need to be addressing that. So I mean, helpfully today, if you go to our LinkedIn, you'll be able to see we've taken those questions that came from the regulator, and we've split it across who should be able to answer them from first through to second line. And there's some, you really need to be pushing that out in terms of asking yourself those questions. And there's one question that I think is really good, and it's, if I was a member of staff, do I know if I'm advising a client that sits outside our target market? And I think a lot of members of staff won't be able to answer that. It's a great question that everybody could ask, from board right through to compliance, through to audit, and all your first line
Say
staff.
that again. I like that. I'm going to capture that. Go on. Go on.
If I'm sat talking to a client, do I know if they are presenting with any characteristics that are outside our target market. And, you'll get a lot of blank faces. It's just, who are you actually dealing with? Consumer duty and the data that sits with it is really about understanding who your customers are and making sure that all your products and services are then aligned to the specific needs of that group. And that's what your data should fundamentally be doing. It should be telling you who your customers are and whether you're delivering against their needs.
Well, from my point of view, Kate, this just it just highlights the importance of employee competence, not training, competence. Yeah. It's when the rubber hits the road, when you've done all your desk-based stuff, and the customer is having a conversation, electronic or voice, with one of your staff, their competence will determine whether that outcome's good or not. So how are you measuring competence? And with respect, most firms I speak to have a blank look on their face when we talk about employee competence, and they point to single point in time training records and go, well, we use this with some of this to make up a belief that they are. It's not a forward-facing risk radar. It's a weakness in your structure. And actually, a lot of the by default of sort of digital first, a lot of the contact that agents or staff are having are much more complicated than they were 5 years ago, because it is by default probably only the complicated ones that are getting through to agents.
Will, talk us through something that the regulator posted as a CP just before Christmas that might have gone under the radar of firms on this webinar.
Yeah, so this is a new routine request for PSD data for lenders, and I think what stands out with this is that we've seen it in a lot of publications. The regulators now, they're calling themselves a data-led regulator, and we see that messaging coming out quite a lot. But this is what stands out, is that this data request runs a lot deeper than it ever has done before. It's shifted away from that aggregated data, and companies are really have to look and critically assess whether they've got the system capability to pull this information. And if they haven't, they're going to have to start doing it quite quickly, and they're going to have to start understanding where the risks are lying as well in their data as well, because that's exactly what the regulator is going to be looking out for. That through this data, they're looking at assessing, the culture of companies. So just the items such as the arrears rates, the reason for loans, etc. That data is all going to be critical, that you're going to have to be able to start pulling and pulling it quickly, and this will translate into other products across the market as well.
And you think that this is a core angle that firms should be really looking at in terms of like the forensic and the minutiae of the data that will be expected by the regulator?
Yeah, I think these are all data points which will map to a lender's customer outcomes.
It's almost like on this, the regulator has given you a template for the type of data you need to be collecting to evidence consumer duty. So you need to go through this and be able to check, could I collect that data? Do I collect that data? Who collects it? Where is it saved to? And are we using it as part of our consumer duty sweep? So for example, if you're lending a huge number of loans, then historically, I don't know many lenders who would have automatically recorded perhaps the purpose of borrowing for every single loan, and be able to report against each single loan's purpose of borrowing.
I noticed that somebody's raised their hand as a question. Because we've got so many people on the webinar, what we're asking you to do is actually post that question in the chat, or use the Q&A section section there, which you can pose that. You're going to get quite a few questions on this, Will and Kate, because this certainly escapes some of us there. So how do we create meaningful data and MI for the board? There's an expectation, isn't there, on senior managers who will be held to account, won't they, for yet again for the data and MI that they sign off there. Are they in a good place, Kate, as you've seen it?
I think some firms are, and I think, to be honest, as long as you're trying. That's the best you can do right now. But you need to be boards really need to be challenging themselves and holding themselves up to the scrutiny before the regulator does, would be my advice. So really question yourselves, are we really clear on what a good outcome looks like for a customer? It's amazing how many boards I speak to on a regular basis, and I'll ask them to say, well, what does good look like for this service that you're offering? And I can get 6 or 7 different answers that, are all equally good, but they're not aligned across the board. So you need to get really clear alignment of what good looks like. And only once you've got that foundation right, can you say, well, this is the data that we need to demonstrate it. You need to get that foundation in terms of what good looks like across the board, and then be able to have the data. And from an SMF perspective, as long as you have recognised what data you need and can demonstrate that you are working towards filling in those blank spaces, that is okay. It isn't that you have to have everything in right now, because again, this is going to be a maturity exercise, and it's about continuous improvement as opposed to a one-off, just done the Consumer Duty Board report, I can rest on my laurels for another year. It's going to be something that is challenged all the time.
Adrian, you've been in that situation as a senior manager, facing the regulator, asking for them to justify and explain why this metric, why this not metric, why can't you measure this, why can't you assess this? What's your expectation?
Yes, right. I have been on the receiving end of it. I think I'm a super pragmatic person. You have to go to first principles, as Kate said, and say, am I authentic and genuine in my approach to this problem or scenario? Can I point to the fact that I have started to take sensible action, that I've got a plan, that we are doing things to make this better, that we're learning from our mistakes, that we're and acknowledging the fact that, here's the thing, right? Welcoming failure. And I'm not sure, I mean, some firms are great, but, we talk about RAG reporting, and I've heard horror stories of individuals telling me that they've had to change the RAG measures because there was too much red on it. So we'll measure something that's easier. And that's preposterous. From a health and safety background where I came from in the energy industry, we would be asking the question, how many near misses did we have? What percentage does that relate to the number of activities that occurred? And common sense says, how reasonable does that feel? So is your board, are your senior managers carrying out a personal reasonableness test to say, does that look right? Forget about, I can't phone up every one of our customers because they don't speak English and all over the place. But reasonably, no one has complained. That'll be a first, unless you've got one customer. So, and it's your mum. So it's completely unreasonable. So I know it's complicated. I'm a big advocate to say this is a complicated thing that firms have got. It's a massive challenge. But where's your reasonableness test? Because if I were the regulator, I'd be looking at it going, well, that's nonsense. But no one's complained.
And boards will be challenging the aggregated data, because as we've said in bullet point number 3, that key insights may be lost in that as well. And we've got to be mindful of that, haven't we? So we've got to have, on one hand, the granularity, but also we've got to have the trends.
That's my point, Philip. You've got a million customers and only 1% of them are complaining, and you're patting yourself on the back. That's a lot of consumer detriment.
Yeah.
So we're counting consumers, not percentages. So is your reporting actually customer centric, or is it accountant centric? So we count percentages. Well, that's great, but we're not dealing with percentages. We're dealing with people. So how many people? So just your own reporting might throw you under the bus if you're not counting people but counting numbers.
And I think that's a really good point. I think the other bit to add from the board perspective is, so for example, the board are now going to get an idea of how many vulnerable customers, or they should be getting an idea of how many vulnerable customers you have and where they sit within the business. The question the board should be asking themselves is, what is our risk appetite for vulnerable customers? And the number of times I say, oh, we don't want, or we'll have vulnerable customers, but we want to keep it at this level. That isn't always the right answer. What the board should be challenging is, okay, based on what we're doing in the service and the product and the market we're operating in, do we expect our number of vulnerable customers to go up this year? If we're in the lending market and we're still in a cost of living crisis, should I be seeing my vulnerable customer numbers move? And which direction should I be seeing them move? So don't just have a static risk appetite. Your risk appetite should reflect the kind of broader environmental factors that are at play here. If you're in motor finance right now, you're going to see your complaints levels going through the roof as a result of the amount of publicity. So don't just say, because we've gone over this number, it definitely means something is wrong. You need to flex and change with the broader environment.
You guys are coming out with such great sound bites that we need a TikTok channel to actually post those there. So I'm going to, that's my to-do job. Snip, a couple of seconds here, seconds there. You know what? We may get up to Kim Kardashian numbers. I don't know. We may get like that. I will. Anyway, let's get back to consumer duty. Okay, Will, board reporting, must-haves. What stands out for you?
I think in terms of the detail, it's got to paint clear pictures against your outcomes, and I think there's going to be a lot more detail at lower level forums, but then the board needs to be able to pull out, what the key messages are from that. And I think just on point number 5 on this slide is that the board needs to be able to put themselves in the shoes of the customer and look at it from a customer's perspective about what that experience is, because I don't think we see that coming across in board meeting minutes, and when we have discussions with board members, you don't hear that kind of point of view as to how they feel the customer's experience would have been. So the MI needs to encourage that, and they need to evidence in the minutes as well. So if the regulator does have a look at minutes and board packs, they need to see that these conversations are having from that perspective as well.
Philip, I'd look at that distribution chain point. We see a lot of customers who have or are outsourcing customer contact, and the lack of credible, authentic visibility of the competence of those people acting on behalf of their brand and interacting with their customers. It's just a void, and I'm surprised. And often, the persons responsible for managing that supplier are very, very junior. This is not an SMF who is regularly necessarily interacting with that organization, that third party, to say, show me how you are evidencing and continuing to ensure your people are competent.
Yeah. And I think it's just worth noting, we see 2 questions at the moment consistently being asked by FCA to firms. And those 2 questions are, the first one is, tell me what has changed since last July. And you need to be able to give them a list. That's the first point of your Consumer Duty Board report. Tell me what is going to change over the next 12 months. That is the second half of your Consumer Duty Board reports. It's as much backward looking as it is forward looking.
I hope you're taking notice on this webinar.
Well, the other thing, if I were a regulator and something untoward happened with your firm, the first thing I would go to is your board report.
Yeah.
Because bear in mind, what you are filing may not be looked at right now, but if you trip over, it's certainly going to be called into evidence. So I do think, I think I've spoken about firms saying, first one's not that important. I think everyone's important because it's a permanent record.
We've looked at pros and cons, good and bad, inward and outward looking indicators here. But Kate, can I just ask you to pick up and talk to us about harnessing MI to identify risks and what firms on this webinar should be looking out for here?
Yeah. I think in terms of the harnessing MI, it's really about that forward looking piece, as well as so my example would be if, for example, you have, let's say 20% of your customers are vulnerable. What I would want to then know is, okay, so how many of those received a different treatment because they were vulnerable? That's the question the regulator would be asking. So your MI is your benchmark piece in terms of, okay, I now know my customer population, 20% of them are vulnerable. Actually, what have I done to deliver something different now I know this? And it might be that you don't have to do much different, because everyone's experience of vulnerability is their own. And you know, as the regulator often pushes, it's their own lived in expectation for what happens to one customer might not mean the same to the other. But it's about taking that data and saying, what does this mean for us as a business? So if I now know that 20% of my customers are vulnerable, or if I know my arrears rates has gone up significantly, have I thought about what that means for my financial promotions or my marketing channels? Have I thought about what that means for my customer support staff? If I can see my complaints numbers going up exponentially because CMCs have got another idea of pushing a particular initiative, have I got enough staff to be able to handle that? These are the kind of questions that you need to be pushing on that identifying harm piece. If my call wait times are going up, what am I doing about capacity? If I ask all my staff, what are the top 3 features of our target market, and I don't get the right answer from 70% of them, what am I going to do to address the harm that my staff don't know enough about consumer duty? So what's my training plan moving forward? It's taking the data and doing something tangible with it, and being at the same time proportionate to your size of business, who you are, the types of customers, and the type and the extent to which consumer duty impacts you, because everyone will have a different, you know, some people will be looking at it through different lenses. I think my advice to firms is, when I see board packs, like Will said, there's always a huge focus on commercials. And let's face it, you know, firms wouldn't be in existence if they weren't making money. Everyone's got to make money and make profit. But make sure there is a balance, and it's hard to do, between what you report on your commercials versus what you report about your customers. Because if the FCA asks for your board pack and it's very commercially focused, automatically a little ding light will go off, and they'll say, okay, well, where's consumer duty in this? Where's consumer duty in that MI to identify risk?
I'm going to pick up, you said it repeatedly, Kate. Have you thought about it? Yeah. And for me, I think this can be simplified to say, have you thought about can you genuinely point to your business having a culture where the customer genuinely is at the heart of your decision making? If something macro changes, if that is your culture, somebody would be asking the question, that must have affected our customers in this group. So if this has happened, that must, and then what have you done about it? So if you're not thinking that way, you are going to be failing. And that's why I think for me, this is about the demonstration of a journey to put the customer at the center of your radar. It's perfectly acceptable to make profits, yeah, but it's expected. But this is, for me, about a journey where you can demonstrate that the customer's at the center of the decision-making process, and that you care. And you can point to, this is the action that we took. It may not have been the best action, but at least you can demonstrate cause and effect. This happened in the macro market. This is what the conclusion that we drew, and this is the action we took. Well, I think you could have taken a better action. Okay, thanks for the feedback.
Yeah,
get on board.
Well, the regulator is very hot on price and value, and talk us about the evidence, that is needed and required to demonstrate to the regulator that improvements have been made in this area.
And Kate just said, in case you haven't seen it, or Will, whoever's going to answer that bit of the question, someone posed the question regarding gap insurances. Has the regulator said that this is the reasonable margin requirement required for that product? Which obviously they haven't, but you might want to help cover that point off, because it's a hot one at the moment.
So I think what we can do for price and value is there's the initial price and value assessment at the beginning when you're assessing your fees and the amount you're charging to the customer and the essential initial profit margin and whether that's fair. But then you've got to look at the product. If it's a product that sort of spans over, a few years, is the customer then consistently getting a benefit or using the benefit of the product over the lifetime of it? And is that being scrutinized? So if you've got a pool of customers, you're seeing they're not making a claim against something and they're not using like a benefit on a prime paid for bank account, what are you doing proactively to continually assess whether that is still being good value for that customer? If they're using their access to, I don't know, airport lounges, or they're using their mobile phone insurance that they get with their bank account. So, and you're charging them £20 a month where they're not actually getting the value. So doing the initial price and value assessment at the beginning, but then having a continual assessment of it as well.
You flagged in your recent article, Will, I'm going to grab a moment with you before Adrian and Kate jump in and answer a few of the questions. But you actually said that firms would do well if they zeroed in on RCA, root cause analysis there. Do you want to just summarize on what you're saying and the reason why perhaps firms might be missing a trick?
Yeah, well, I've worked in-house quite a lot in my time when I've worked as a consultant, and I think what I commonly see is that complaints is always seen as a regulatory tick box. We got to handle our complaints in line with DISP, and it's seen as a back office function because it's not fee earning effectively. And that means that inherently companies aren't investing in their system to flag root cause at the granular level, and that means they're not having the ability to produce root cause analysis across all their complaints, and they're looking at individual silo complaints and upholding or rejecting and assuming that final response letter to the customer is the outcome. But really there needs to be looking at all these complaints and saying, what is the trend? Are there any complaints coming out of contact centres, or any complaints coming out of financial promotions? And using that data to then feed back into continuous improvement. So it's a really good tool to demonstrate that you are proactive in identifying trends and improving outcomes across your processes.
Why aren't firms? Is it because it's just considered because it's not fee earning, or is there something systematically in their culture that perhaps doesn't prioritize that as an opportunity?
I think culturally, I just think it's the kind of almost the grind between first and second line sometimes and handling complaints, and sometimes they just think a complaint should be handled by the complaints team or the second line team, and it's not an operationally beneficial process. And I think the first line or the other business areas really needs to be sold the benefits of this, root cause analysis that I've just spoken about, and what else you can use complaints information for. So I think culturally it comes down to a lot of it.
And I think this is just on that complaints point. This is the data FCA have access to. If we look at what's happened in motor finance recently, that is on the back of complaints data. So they have identified a harm based on the number of rising complaints in a particular area and the firm uphold rate. So they are looking at both constantly in terms of number of complaints from FOS. What are they complaining to about FOS? What is the firm's uphold rate in relation to this? So they're using that data now, and that's what's generating their intervention so far.
Adrian, when we talk about must-have data points to support an understanding, identification of vulnerable customers, as well as actually actions that we can address or anticipate harm, how can the frontline be used better or more effectively to support adherence to consumer duty?
I'm going to come back to my hobby horse: competence, not training. Yeah, with respect, I'm not sure there's many employers out there who are that fussed about having super knowledgeable staff. I think every employer out there is super fussed about having very highly competent enrolled employees, and the two are very, very different. And culturally, I'm sure that lots of people on this webinar, there'll be a lot of people metaphorically shaking their head or nodding and saying, yeah, I recognise the fact that historically we've ticked a box as far as training is concerned. because that's all we had to do. I just think the bar's raised considerably. If your evidence to yourself looking in the mirror is, I know that we've got vulnerability sorted because we trained our people on it in January, and therefore it's sorted, I think you're deluding yourself. Because what you need to be able to do is to evidence that your employees are genuinely competent and can have credible conversations with your customers and pick up the nuances. Yeah, because it is a human thing. Yeah, it's the picking up the nuances, it's picking up the differences. So for me, it's, are you measuring competence? Have you taken this seriously? And it may not be your fault. You may have been starved of the resources and funding. Let's be honest, there's a lot of people on here who say that to me regularly. I'm not given that level of resource to sort that out.
Kate, the regulator's not going to take much much sympathy with you if you've kind of like mentally or culturally put identification of vulnerable customers or recognition of vulnerability in the too difficult bucket. That's not going to work, is it?
It's not gonna fly, that one. Yeah, there's a number of firms that have now worked towards flagging where their vulnerable customer data are, which is a great start. It's now, what do you do with those customers and what do we do differently? And I think it's like all of this. We started simple and we're maturing, and firms' journey is changing, as is the regulator's thought process. So when it comes to vulnerability, it's about saying, okay, now we know where they are. What do they need that is different compared to a non-vulnerable customer? And I think that's the biggest question you can ask yourselves on that.
We touched upon it earlier in this webinar about consumer duty implementation. I posted again the outcomes from that good practice guide that Kate referenced earlier there. Panelists, just want to pick out one or two areas of what the good, the bad, and the ugly that the regulator have raised, but also perhaps what also you're seeing as well from firms. So where are the rooms for improvement? Equally, what's a nod to what the regulator likes? We had a laugh and a giggle whether my 80-year-old mum would be taking selfies of herself in Kingston upon Thames and getting the camera angle the wrong way round. But apart from that, are there any other issues or challenges where you've seen good practice, perhaps, Will, or rooms for improvement?
I think there's a danger to fall into this trap of having a policy in place traditionally where you're waiting for a customer to tell you about their vulnerable circumstance. So you're waiting for them to get on the phone and say that they've got, a health condition or they've been through a life event, and that's your duty done with identifying the vulnerability. But really, you need to be looking at your data you're gathering from your customers a lot earlier on in the journey, and that's very much back end what I've just described. At the front, during underwriting, if you're underwriting loans or that kind of information, there's vulnerable customer information in that around financial resilience or people's ability to interpret information or responses to financial promotions, for example. So you need to think broader than just waiting for the customer to contact you and tell you that they're vulnerable.
Kate, which points do you resonate with what the FCA thinks is a thumbs up, or perhaps identify where the FCA have actually said, are you sure that you should be actually talking about vulnerability in that way to a customer or asking them to self-identify, etc., etc.?
I think what firms need to be cognizant of is being able to demonstrate to the regulator across their business model what is an inherent vulnerability. So, for example, we know customers are going to come into financial difficulty at some point. If, as a lender, we are going to have an element of vulnerability there. So how much resource, time and support have we built managing that known inherent vulnerability? So I'd split it between inherent and actual realised. So as we then work through, and we're in the kind of cost of living crisis, so we know we've got vulnerable customers who are facing financial difficulty. What actually are we doing differently for them in terms of managing that vulnerability? And I would ask yourselves kind of what initiatives have we put in place today to manage vulnerability?
Good. we've got an opportunity, and this is the first time on a Nelly webinar that we've actually ended on time, I should say. We've got over the line, which is better than the England rugby team did at the weekend. But I just wanted to actually grab from you, get a sense check on perhaps what are you going to do differently, or what is it that you're going to perhaps register, take away from this webinar, perhaps what has disturbed you in a positive way, or challenged you in a positive way, whereby perhaps you could reflect on what we've said, because we've got a number of key points there. We're not going to publish the answers there, but maybe it gives you an opportunity to post in the session, in the poll question that we've got on the screen. What are you going to do differently? What's going to change as a result of the key points and the key challenges that Adrian, Kate and Will have made and through this webinar? And it just gives us a sense check of where we can support you as a firm, but also you as an individual. If you're head of compliance, head of legal, leading the risk function in your organization, where can we support you better or more effectively in this? This webinar will be obviously recorded, and therefore a PDF version of the slides will be posted to you. But yeah, we just want to capture that and actually make you accountable for the next time we talk about board packs next month on our forthcoming webinar program. Thank you for that. Be quite interesting to see the results. But as we've got on the screen, this is your opportunity to reach out to colleagues at Avyse, as well as reach out to Elephants. Don't forget to actually talk about the points and actually discuss further directly with those individuals and those organizations who can help you implement and embed. Final thoughts from you, starting with you, Adrian.
Thanks. Yes. One of the questions, I'll come back to that third party point that says, well, you know, if I've outsourced my parlance, if I've outsourced my contact to Fred Outsourcing Limited, it's Fred's responsibility to ensure that all of the agents are compliant. Well, yes, and it's yours. So you can't delegate that responsibility. Ultimately, you're the regulated party and you are responsible for the actions of those agents, even though they may work for Fred in South Africa. Yeah. So I see quite a lot of this. Well, you know, Fred's doing that. I mean, for me, it's a massive own goal. You need to be involved in auditing whether or not Fred is doing that genuinely, or whether he's just ticking a box and sending you some data and not management information.
Yeah.
I want to know, Adrian. I want to know, Adrian, how do you actually hand clap yourself when you're actually talking on the webinar?
Yes, it's preordained. You set it up. I'll show you how to do that, Philip.
Sorry,
I've got kids here doing it.
Sorry, Kate, go on. Sorry.
Just there was a question that came up as Adrian was saying that, you know, if your distributor or your third party isn't providing the information you need, what would the FCA's be expectation? To take action and escalate. And if there becomes a point at which they are not doing what you need them to do, the expectation would be a termination at the end of that, after, you know, various steps. But it's worth bearing in mind.
This is my point about, you know, shouting out. Is the second line going to be doing that and going to the first line saying these people, they're not doing a good enough job?
Yeah.
I think
it should be the first line. This comes back to our point, and you know what we've published today on LinkedIn. It's everybody's responsibility, consumer duty. It isn't just second line. So use your first line, use your board, and get them to own it. Be my advice.
You're ruining my timing, both of you.
No, look, it's a great one.
20 seconds. Final 20 seconds.
It's fantastic. Kate, well, thanks very much. It's the first one we've ever finished on time.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks,
All right.
all.
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.